There is a strange kind of memory that every human being carries, yet almost no one notices it. It is not the memory of childhood. It is not the memory of yesterday. It is not even the memory of events that have already happened. Instead, it is the memory of possibilities that have not yet become reality. Consider a simple decision. You stand at a crossroads in your life. Perhaps it is a career opportunity, a relationship, a conversation that will alter everything. Before you consciously weigh the evidence, before you list the advantages and disadvantages, before logic begins assembling its familiar arguments, something else often happens first. You hesitate, or you feel unexpectedly certain. A quiet sensation appears that seems to come from nowhere. Sometimes it arrives as excitement without explanation. Sometimes it appears as an irrational fear that refuses to disappear, despite every logical reason to ignore it. Occasionally, it feels like an invisible hand, gently nudging you toward a path you never intended to take. Most people dismiss these moments. They call them instinct, emotion, intuition, coincidence. Yet neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, and modern theories of prediction increasingly suggest that these experiences may reveal something far more remarkable about the architecture of the human mind. Not because your future is already written, but because your brain may constantly be constructing versions of your future that influence who you become in the present. What if your future self is not sending messages backward through time? What if something even stranger is happening? What if your present mind is continuously being shaped by simulations of the person you are becoming? To understand why this possibility deserves serious consideration, we first need to abandon one of the oldest assumptions about human consciousness. Most of us imagine ourselves moving through time like passengers riding inside a train. The past lies behind us. The future waits ahead. The present is a tiny point moving relentlessly forward. This picture feels obvious because it matches our daily experience. We remember yesterday. We cannot remember tomorrow. Therefore, we conclude that information only travels in one direction. But our experience of time is not necessarily the same thing as the mechanisms our brains use to navigate it. For centuries, scientists believed perception worked much like a camera. Light entered the eyes, information traveled into the brain, reality was recorded. Consciousness simply observed what already existed. Today, that understanding has been almost completely reversed. Your brain is not primarily a recording device. It is a prediction machine. Every second of every day, billions of neurons work together to generate expectations about what will happen next. Before your eyes finish processing an image, your brain has already guessed what it expects to see. Before someone completes a sentence, your mind predicts the ending. Before your foot touches the ground, your nervous system estimates where your balance will be. Without these predictions, ordinary life would become almost impossible. Walking would require conscious calculation. Reading would feel painfully slow. Conversations would collapse into confusion. The remarkable speed of human perception depends on the brain's ability to anticipate reality before reality fully arrives. Scientists often describe this process as predictive processing. Rather than waiting passively for information, the brain constantly creates internal models of the world. Incoming sensory information is compared against these predictions. When prediction and reality agree, almost nothing changes. When reality surprises the model, the brain updates itself. In this sense, perception is less like watching a movie and more like editing a screenplay that is being written while it is performed. Every experience becomes a negotiation between expectation and observation. This simple insight changes everything, because once the brain begins predicting the external world, it cannot stop there. It also predicts you, who you will become, how you will react, what you will believe tomorrow, whether you will succeed, whether you will fail. Every choice you make becomes part of an ongoing simulation that stretches far beyond the present moment. Imagine standing before two doors. Behind one door lies a familiar life, predictable, comfortable, safe. Behind the other lies uncertainty, challenge, growth, risk. Long before you consciously decide which door to open, your brain has already begun simulating thousands of possible futures. Each simulation generates emotional signals. Each imagined outcome changes your physiology. Your heartbeat shifts. Hormones adjust. Attention narrows towards certain possibilities while ignoring countless others. Without realizing it, your body begins responding not only to reality, but also to futures that exist entirely inside prediction. In many situations, those imagined futures influence your actions more powerfully than the present itself. A student studies harder because she imagines becoming a successful doctor. An athlete trains despite exhaustion because he experiences a future victory long before it arrives. A parent sacrifices comfort today because they can vividly picture the adult their child may one day become. None of these futures exist, yet they reshape present behavior with extraordinary force. It is tempting to dismiss these examples as simple motivation, but the underlying mechanism reaches much deeper. Research in neuroscience suggests that the brain uses future-oriented simulation as one of its primary tools for survival. Humans possess an unusual ability known as episodic future thinking. Unlike most animals, we can mentally construct detailed scenes that have never happened. We rehearse conversations before speaking. We imagine disasters before traveling. We visualize achievements years before they occur. These imagined futures are not entertainment. They are cognitive laboratories. Inside them, the brain experiments with countless possible lives, without forcing the body to experience every consequence directly. Every simulation becomes information. Every imagined failure teaches caution. Every imagined success builds confidence. The future, in this sense, becomes an invisible training ground, continuously shaping present identity. But something curious begins to happen when these simulations become increasingly detailed. The boundary separating imagination from memory begins to blur. Think carefully about a future event you have anticipated for months. Perhaps your graduation, a wedding, the birth of a child, an important interview. You may discover that parts of this imagined future feel strangely familiar before they ever occur, not because you have lived them, but because your brain has rehearsed them so many times that they begin acquiring the emotional texture normally associated with memory. This may explain why certain moments produce the unsettling sensation known as déjà vu. For an instant, reality appears strangely familiar. Many explanations have been proposed for this phenomenon. Brief neurological delays, memory processing errors, pattern recognition glitches. Yet regardless of the exact mechanism, déjà vu reminds us of something profoundly important. The brain does not always maintain perfect boundaries between prediction, imagination, and recollection. Sometimes those boundaries briefly dissolve. When they do, we glimpse how fluid our internal experience of time truly is. If prediction can feel like memory, if imagined futures can alter present behavior, if simulations continuously rewrite identity, then perhaps the question is no longer whether the future influences us. Perhaps the real question is how deeply it already does, because the next discovery will challenge something even more fundamental. It will force us to ask whether the person making today's decisions is truly the present version of you, or whether every important choice has already become a quiet negotiation between countless versions of yourself that have not yet been born. Imagine that every morning, before you open your eyes, your brain has already begun preparing for a day that does not yet exist. It has estimated the sounds you are likely to hear, the faces you are likely to encounter, the emotions you are likely to experience, the mistakes you are likely to make, the rewards you are likely to receive. This preparation happens silently, beneath conscious awareness, long before the voice inside your mind begins narrating your plans. You awaken believing you are responding to reality as it unfolds. But in many ways, reality is first filtered through expectations that were assembled before the day even truly began. This is not a flaw in human cognition. It is one of its greatest achievements. A creature that can only react to the present rarely survives as efficiently as one capable of anticipating what comes next. A deer survives because it predicts movement in the grass before confirming a predator. A pilot survives because she predicts the aircraft's behavior before turbulence arrives. A surgeon succeeds because years of simulation allow thousands of tiny movements to unfold before conscious thought can intervene. Prediction is not an optional feature of intelligence. It is intelligence itself. Yet once we recognize prediction as the foundation of perception, another realization begins to emerge. The most important thing your brain predicts is not the world. It is you. Every identity you believe you possess is, to some degree, a forecast. When someone asks who you are, the answer often sounds like a description of the past. I've always been shy. I've never been good at mathematics. I'm the kind of person who stays calm under pressure. I always make the wrong decisions. These statements feel like memories, but neuroscientifically, they function more like prediction models. Each one quietly informs the brain what to expect from the next situation. Each becomes a template that shapes future behavior before experience has the opportunity to challenge it. A child who repeatedly hears, "You're talented," begins predicting success. Another, who repeatedly hears, "You'll never amount to anything," begins anticipating failure. Eventually, both individuals start behaving in ways that reinforce the very identities they inherited, not because destiny exists, but because prediction influences attention, attention influences behavior, behavior influences outcome, outcome reinforces prediction. The loop closes. Identity becomes self-maintaining. This is one reason psychological change often feels so difficult. People assume they are fighting old habits. In reality, they are often confronting future expectations that have already become embedded within the brain's predictive architecture. When someone attempts to change careers at 40, quit an addiction, leave a destructive relationship, or finally pursue a lifelong dream, the greatest resistance rarely comes from external circumstances alone. It comes from an internal model insisting, "That isn't who we become." Notice the language. Not who we were, who we become. The predictive brain constantly protects continuity. Its primary objective is not happiness, nor truth, nor fulfillment. Its first responsibility is reducing uncertainty. Certainty conserves energy. Prediction minimizes surprise. The familiar feels safe, even when it causes suffering. This explains one of the strangest paradoxes of human life. People frequently remain inside painful situations they desperately wish to escape, not because they enjoy suffering, but because the future beyond suffering is unpredictable. The unknown demands new models, new identities, new expectations, and the brain, optimized for efficiency rather than transformation, naturally resists rebuilding itself. For thousands of years, philosophers struggled with a similar mystery. Why do people knowingly act against their own interests? Why repeat destructive behaviors despite understanding their consequences? Ancient traditions described weakness of will. Modern psychology describes cognitive biases. Neuroscience increasingly points toward prediction. The future we unconsciously expect often outweighs the future we consciously desire. Suppose two individuals receive the exact same opportunity. The first quietly believes success is possible. The second expects inevitable failure. Objectively, nothing has changed. Subjectively, everything has. The first notices possibilities. The second notices obstacles. The first interprets setbacks as temporary. The second interprets them as confirmation. Within months, their lives may appear radically different, not because reality favored one over the other, but because each person's internal simulation directed attention toward different aspects of the same world. Reality became filtered through expectation. This phenomenon extends far beyond individual psychology. Entire societies build predictive models. Cultures inherit expectations. Families transmit futures before children possess language to question them. Imagine growing up, hearing that your community has always been resilient. Now imagine growing up hearing that your community has always been powerless. Both narratives become invisible maps. Long before a child understands economics, politics, or history, those maps begin shaping countless micro decisions. What careers feel imaginable? What relationships feel normal? What risks feel acceptable? What dreams appear realistic? Again and again, tomorrow quietly organizes today. But there is another dimension to prediction that makes this story even more fascinating. The brain does not simulate only one future. It simulates many. At every significant decision, countless possible versions of your life briefly coexist inside neural activity. One version accepts the offer, another declines it, one speaks honestly, another remains silent, one chooses courage, another chooses comfort. These futures flash into existence so quickly that consciousness notices only the final decision. Yet, hidden beneath awareness lies an extraordinary competition. Neural populations continuously evaluate competing possibilities before one eventually dominates. You never experience most of these alternative selves, but for a brief moment, they existed, not as mystical parallel universes, as genuine biological simulations. In laboratory experiments, researchers have observed that neural activity often reflects multiple competing actions before movement occurs. Even something as simple as reaching for a cup involves countless predictions being generated, compared, rejected, and refined. Decision-making resembles evolution, compressed into milliseconds. Numerous possibilities emerge, only one survives. Now expand this mechanism beyond physical movement. Imagine choosing where to live, whom to marry, whether to forgive, whether to remain silent, whether to leave. Every major decision may involve an internal population of possible futures competing for existence. The person you eventually become is not merely selected. They are gradually stabilized. This realization transforms the familiar question, "Who am I?" into something much more dynamic. Perhaps identity is not a fixed object waiting to be discovered. Perhaps identity is the temporary winner of an ongoing negotiation among countless possible futures. If that is true, then your future self is not a single individual waiting somewhere ahead in time. It is a continuously evolving probability landscape. Some versions grow stronger, others quietly disappear. Every choice shifts the landscape. Every experience changes the odds. Every act of attention feeds one future while starving another. In this sense, your future is already participating in your present. Not because it has traveled backward through time, but because your brain cannot stop calculating which version of tomorrow deserves to become real. Yet an even deeper mystery remains. If the brain is constantly simulating future versions of ourselves, where do those simulations come from? Why does one imagined future feel compelling while another feels empty? Why do certain possibilities seem to call us with extraordinary emotional force, while countless others vanish almost immediately? To answer those questions, we must leave neuroscience for a moment and enter one of the oldest conversations in human history, where philosophers, physicists, and psychologists unexpectedly begin describing the same invisible phenomenon from remarkably different directions. Long before laboratories could measure electrical activity inside the brain, long before psychologists could study decision-making with scanners and behavioral experiments, human beings had already noticed something impossible to ignore. People often lived as though they were being pulled toward a future they could not yet explain. Ancient storytellers described it as destiny. Religious traditions called it vocation. Greek philosophers spoke of telos, the intrinsic end toward which every living thing naturally develops. A seed does not merely exist, it unfolds toward becoming a tree. A river does not randomly wander. It follows invisible contours toward the sea. Perhaps, they wondered, human life follows a similar pattern. Not because every event is predetermined, but because possibilities possess different degrees of attraction. Modern language rarely speaks this way. We prefer explanations built from causes rather than purposes. We ask what pushed us. Rarely do we ask what might be pulling us. Yet the experience remains remarkably common. An artist feels compelled to create long before receiving recognition. A scientist becomes obsessed with a question decades before discovering its answer. An explorer crosses oceans without knowing exactly what is waiting on the other side. From the outside, these decisions appear irrational. From the inside, they often feel strangely inevitable. People frequently describe them with the same phrase. I don't know why, I just knew. Were these individuals receiving messages from the future? Almost certainly not. But neither were they acting randomly. They were responding to an internal model that had become more emotionally convincing than every available alternative. This distinction matters because emotion is not simply something that happens after decisions. Emotion is one of the primary tools through which the predictive brain assigns value to possible futures. Imagine standing inside a vast library. Every book contains a different version of your life. One tells the story of caution, another describes ambition, another sacrifice, another comfort, another loneliness, another extraordinary achievement. You cannot read them all. Instead, your mind rapidly assigns emotional significance to each possibility. Some books immediately feel heavy, others seem strangely luminous. Without consciously understanding why, you reach toward one before the others. That emotional pull is not evidence that the future already exists. It is evidence that your nervous system has learned to estimate which future appears most meaningful, most survivable, or most coherent with everything it already believes. Meaning itself becomes a prediction. This insight begins explaining one of the deepest mysteries of motivation. Why can two people observe the same opportunity and experience completely different emotions? Imagine two graduates receiving identical job offers in another country. One feels excitement, the other feels terror. Nothing in external reality has changed. Only the internal simulation differs. The first brain predicts expansion, the second predicts loss. Different futures, different emotions, different decisions. Again, tomorrow quietly reorganizes today. Psychologist Viktor Frankl observed something remarkable while imprisoned during the Second World War. Among individuals enduring unimaginable suffering, those who maintained a compelling sense of future purpose often demonstrated extraordinary psychological resilience. The future itself had not arrived. Their circumstances remained horrific, yet an imagined tomorrow altered how they experienced the present. Hope was not merely optimism, it became an organizing force. Frankl famously argued that those who possess a reason to live can endure almost any circumstance. Whether or not one accepts every aspect of his philosophy, modern neuroscience increasingly supports an important element of this observation. The brain allocates energy differently when meaningful future states remain believable. Purpose changes physiology. Expectation changes perception. Meaning changes endurance. Perhaps this explains why losing hope feels physically exhausting. When the predictive system can no longer generate a future worth pursuing, motivation begins collapsing from within. It is not simply sadness. It is a disruption in the architecture that normally organizes behavior across time. The future ceases acting as an attractor. The present loses direction. This idea appears again in an unexpected place: physics. No, physics does not claim that your future self sends secret messages backward through time. But some physical systems behave in ways that challenge our everyday intuition about causality. Consider a simple example. Drop a marble into a bowl. No one is surprised when it rolls toward the lowest point. The marble is not being pushed solely by its past position. Its movement is constrained by the shape of the landscape surrounding it. Scientists often describe complex systems using something called an attractor. An attractor is not necessarily a destination already reached. It is a region towards which behavior naturally evolves. Weather systems possess attractors. Planetary orbits possess attractors. Even populations of neurons can settle into stable activity patterns known as attractor states. The concept becomes fascinating when applied metaphorically to human cognition. Perhaps your future identity functions less like a destination and more like an attractor, not fixed, not inevitable, but increasingly influential as your experiences accumulate. Every skill you practice deepens one valley while allowing countless others to disappear. Every habit reshapes the landscape. Every belief modifies which futures become easiest to enter. Imagine walking through fresh snow. The first footprints require enormous effort. The second pass becomes easier. Eventually, a path forms. After enough repetition, leaving the path becomes difficult, not because alternative routes vanish, but because the existing trail continually invites you back. The brain behaves similarly. Repeated thoughts strengthen neural pathways. Repeated behaviors stabilize predictions. Repeated identities become increasingly automatic. The future you repeatedly imagine begins constructing the road you eventually walk. This may be why visualization techniques sometimes improve performance. Contrary to popular myths, visualization does not magically summon reality. Instead, it trains predictive networks. Elite athletes mentally rehearse competitions. Musicians silently perform difficult passages. Astronauts repeatedly imagine emergencies before launch. These simulations refine expectations. When reality finally arrives, the nervous system responds with greater confidence because part of the experience has already been organized internally. The future influenced the present by being rehearsed. But rehearsal reveals something even stranger. Each time you imagine tomorrow, tomorrow changes you. Close your eyes and vividly imagine spending the next decade mastering a craft you deeply love. Notice what happens. Your posture subtly shifts. Your breathing changes. Your emotional state evolves. Nothing external has occurred. Yet your biology has already begun responding. Now imagine spending the next decade trapped inside a life you secretly fear. The body reacts differently. Again, nothing has happened, but prediction alone reorganizes physiology. The future is acting upon the present, not through supernatural forces, but through expectation embodied in flesh and neurons. Perhaps this is why imagination has always occupied such a peculiar place in human evolution. It is not merely entertainment, it is biological preparation. It allows organisms to experience consequences before reality demands payment. The remarkable advantage of Homo sapiens may not simply be intelligence. It may be the ability to let imagined futures reshape present behavior with extraordinary precision. And yet, there remains one unsettling question that neuroscience still cannot fully answer. Why do certain moments arrive in life when an entirely new future suddenly becomes visible? Not gradually, but all at once? A single conversation, a single book, a single encounter, a single unexpected loss. Within hours, decades of prediction seem to reorganize themselves. It is as though another version of your future has suddenly become more believable than the one you carried yesterday. How can an entire identity pivot so quickly? To answer that, we must examine the hidden machinery of transformation itself. Because the greatest influence your future self may have over you is not telling you what will happen. It is quietly changing what you believe is possible before you ever realize your life has begun to move in a completely different direction. Transformation rarely announces itself. When people look back on their lives, they often divide their story into dramatic chapters. Before the move, before the accident, before the discovery, before meeting that one person. From the outside, these moments appear to be sudden turning points. A single decision seems to split one life into two completely different futures. But the brain tells a quieter story. Long before a visible transformation occurs, invisible changes have already been accumulating beneath awareness. Neurons strengthen connections that are repeatedly activated. Old prediction models weaken when they consistently fail. Attention gradually shifts toward new possibilities. Tiny adjustments, almost impossible to notice in isolation, slowly alter the landscape of expectation. Then one ordinary day, a conversation, a sentence, or a seemingly insignificant event appears to change everything. It feels instantaneous. In reality, the mind has often been preparing for that moment for months, years, or even decades. Think about learning to read. At first, every letter demands conscious effort. Each word is assembled one symbol at a time. Then, almost without noticing when it happened, reading becomes effortless. The transformation feels sudden because consciousness experiences only the final transition. The countless microscopic adaptations that made it possible remained invisible. Identity evolves in much the same way. We imagine that people suddenly become courageous, suddenly become compassionate, suddenly become leaders, suddenly become artists. Yet beneath every apparent breakthrough lies an enormous accumulation of predictions, quietly reorganizing themselves over time. Every experience updates the internal model. Every failure contributes information. Every success changes probability. The future self does not appear fully formed. It gradually becomes the most stable prediction the brain can generate. This helps explain why profound personal change often begins long before we recognize it. Someone trapped in an unfulfilling career may spend years feeling restless without understanding why. A relationship that once felt secure slowly becomes emotionally distant. An old ambition refuses to disappear despite repeated attempts to ignore it. These experiences can seem mysterious because consciousness searches for a single explanation. The predictive brain, however, is integrating thousands of variables simultaneously. It notices subtle inconsistencies long before awareness can describe them. Patterns emerge beneath language. The body often senses them first. There is a curious phenomenon that psychologists sometimes describe as the feeling of knowing. You walk into a room and immediately sense that something is different. You cannot yet identify what has changed. Moments later, you realize a familiar object has been moved. Conscious recognition arrives after unconscious detection. Your nervous system perceived the discrepancy before your conscious mind could explain it. Now imagine this process unfolding across months instead of seconds. Tiny inconsistencies accumulate between who you are and who your current identity predicts you should be. Most remain below awareness, until eventually the discrepancy becomes impossible to ignore. People often describe this experience with phrases like, "I woke up one morning and realized I couldn't keep living this way. I suddenly knew I had to leave. I finally understood what I wanted. The realization feels immediate. The computation was anything but." Beneath awareness, the predictive machinery had been updating for years. This hidden process may explain why genuine transformation often feels less like creating a new self and more like recognizing one that has been quietly emerging all along. Carl Jung hinted at something remarkably similar. He argued that much of psychological development involves integrating aspects of ourselves that have remained outside conscious awareness. Whether one agrees with every aspect of Jung's theory or not, modern neuroscience offers an intriguing parallel. The brain continuously generates possibilities that consciousness never fully experiences. Some disappear. Others remain dormant. A few slowly gather strength until they reshape the entire system. Perhaps growth is not the invention of a new identity. Perhaps it is the stabilization of a possibility that has been patiently waiting beneath the surface. This perspective changes how we understand regret. Most people think regret comes from remembering the past. But psychologically, regret is deeply connected to imagined futures. When someone says, "I wish I had accepted that opportunity," they are rarely grieving the decision itself. They are grieving the future that never became available. The brain constructs an alternative life with astonishing detail. It imagines friendships that never formed, cities never visited, children never born. Books never written, conversations never spoken. These simulations can feel emotionally real because the predictive system treats them as genuine possibilities, even though reality selected a different path. In other words, we do not only remember our past, we also mourn our unrealized futures. This realization reveals something profound about consciousness. Human beings do not experience time as a straight line. Internally, we live inside a network of overlapping timelines. Memories reconstruct the past. Predictions construct the future. Attention negotiates between both. The present is not an isolated point. It is an active meeting place where remembered experience and anticipated possibility continuously shape one another. Every decision emerges from that meeting. Even free will begins to look different. For centuries, philosophers argued over whether human choices are truly free or entirely determined. The debate often assumes that decisions occur at a single moment, but neuroscience suggests something far more dynamic. Choices unfold gradually. Countless unconscious evaluations precede conscious awareness. The conscious mind often enters the process surprisingly late. This has led some researchers to question whether free will exists at all. Yet that conclusion may be too simple. Perhaps freedom is not located in a single instant of choice. Perhaps it exists in something much larger. Every book you read, every person you spend time with, every habit you reinforce, every environment you repeatedly enter, quietly reshapes the predictions your brain will generate tomorrow. In other words, while you may not consciously choose every individual thought, you can influence the architecture that produces future thoughts. Freedom becomes less about controlling each decision and more about cultivating the system that eventually makes those decisions. Gardeners do not command individual flowers to bloom. They prepare the soil. Likewise, human beings rarely command inspiration, courage, compassion, or wisdom into existence. They create conditions under which those qualities become increasingly probable. The future self begins influencing today's choices, because today's choices are already redesigning tomorrow's predictive landscape. This relationship is circular rather than linear. Present actions build future identity. Future identity reorganizes present attention. The loop never stops. Then something extraordinary begins to emerge. The individual you will become tomorrow is already participating in the creation of the person you are becoming today, not through impossible violations of physics, but through recursive prediction. Your brain continually asks, if this is who we are becoming, how should we act now? Every answer changes the next question. The cycle repeats thousands of times each day. Eventually, identity itself becomes less like a photograph and more like a conversation unfolding across time. A conversation between every version of yourself that has ever existed and every version that still might. Yet, one final mystery remains. If our future is constantly influencing the present through prediction, how do we distinguish between a future that merely feels familiar and one that truly deserves to become reality? Because the greatest danger is not that the future shapes us. The greatest danger is allowing the wrong future to do so. Every human life is guided by invisible stories. Some were inherited before we were old enough to question them. Some were written by moments of triumph. Others emerged from failure, heartbreak, fear, or survival. Most remain so deeply embedded within our minds that we mistake them for reality itself. Yet beneath every story lies a prediction. This is how people like me live. This is how relationships end. This is what success looks like. This is what always happens. The predictive brain quietly transforms these narratives into expectations. Expectations become attention. Attention becomes behavior. Behavior becomes experience. Experience reinforces the original story. And before long, what began as a prediction starts looking like destiny. Perhaps this is why so many people feel trapped inside lives they never consciously chose. Not because the future was written in advance, but because an unconscious forecast became so convincing that every decision slowly organized itself around making that forecast come true. The remarkable truth is that the brain is astonishingly loyal. Once it believes a particular future is most likely, it will continuously search for evidence that confirms its own prediction. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Neuroscientists describe it as minimizing prediction error. Whatever language we choose, the consequence is the same. We begin noticing only the parts of reality that support the future we already expect. Imagine wearing a pair of glasses with a faint blue tint. At first, the world appears normal. After enough time, you forget the glasses exist. Eventually, blue simply becomes reality. Prediction functions in much the same way. It colors perception without announcing its presence. We believe we are observing the world objectively. More often, we are observing reality through expectations accumulated over an entire lifetime. But there is something profoundly hopeful hidden inside this realization. If expectations shape perception, then changing expectations changes the world we are capable of seeing. Not because external reality magically transforms overnight, but because entirely new possibilities suddenly become visible. History is filled with people who accomplished things their societies considered impossible. The first explorers who crossed unknown oceans. The scientists who imagined invisible forces before instruments could detect them. The artists who created styles no audience initially understood. The activists who envisioned justice decades before laws reflected it. None of these individuals possessed certainty. They possessed a different prediction. They rehearsed futures that other minds could not yet imagine. Eventually, enough actions accumulated that those futures became reality. In this sense, civilization itself may be humanity's greatest predictive project. Every city began as imagination. Every bridge began as simulation. Every scientific theory began as a mental model, competing against older ones. The future has always reshaped the present through human expectation. You are participating in that process even now. As these words enter your awareness, your brain is quietly comparing them against everything it already believes about itself. Some ideas feel immediately plausible. Others encounter resistance. Some will disappear within minutes. Others may remain for years, not because the documentary has changed you directly, but because it has introduced new possibilities into the predictive landscape your mind continuously explores. Whether those possibilities survive depends on what happens next. This raises one final question. If countless futures compete for influence inside every human mind, which one deserves your attention? The answer is unlikely to be the one that feels easiest. The brain naturally favors familiarity. Familiarity often masquerades as truth, yet growth almost always begins where prediction becomes uncertain. Every meaningful transformation in human history required someone willing to inhabit a future that did not yet feel normal. The scientist who questioned accepted knowledge. The entrepreneur who invested before success existed. The parent who broke generations of inherited behavior. The patient who continued rehabilitation despite overwhelming odds. The ordinary individual who decided that tomorrow did not have to resemble yesterday. Each acted before evidence fully justified confidence, not irrationally, but because a different future gradually became more believable than the old one. This may be the deepest form of courage, not acting without fear, but allowing a wiser prediction to become stronger than an older one. The future self, then, is not waiting somewhere ahead like a completed person patiently observing your life, nor is it sending mysterious messages backward through time. It is emerging continuously through every expectation you strengthen, every habit you repeat, every belief you reinforce, and every possibility you choose to nourish. In a profound sense, your future self is less like a destination and more like a conversation. Every action asks a question. Every consequence provides an answer. Every answer slightly rewrites the model that generates tomorrow's decisions. The dialogue never ends. This perspective also transforms the meaning of identity. Perhaps there has never been one fixed you. The child you once were no longer predicts the world in the same way. The teenager who feared rejection, the adult who learned resilience, the older self who will someday look back on this very moment. All are connected, yet none are identical. Consciousness is not a statue carved once and preserved forever. It is a living process of continuous prediction, revision, and adaptation. A river remains recognizably the same, even though none of its water is permanent. Perhaps the self behaves similarly, always changing, always flowing, always becoming. This realization carries an unexpected responsibility. If tomorrow is constantly shaping today through prediction, then every thought you repeatedly entertain becomes a quiet vote for one version of your future. Every habit becomes an architect. Every conversation becomes a blueprint. Every decision strengthens one possibility while allowing countless others to fade. Most of this occurs silently, almost invisibly. But over years, those tiny shifts accumulate into what we eventually call a life. And so we return to the question that began this journey. Why might your future self already be influencing your decisions? Not because time is flowing backward, not because destiny has already been written, not because some hidden force is whispering instructions from tomorrow. but because your brain cannot survive without continuously constructing tomorrow before it arrives. Those imagined tomorrows become predictions. Predictions become perception. Perception becomes action. Action becomes reality. And reality becomes the future from which new predictions are born. The future has always been influencing you, not as a place that already exists, but as a possibility your mind is constantly learning to believe. The most important version of your future self is therefore not the one waiting at the end of your life. It is the one you are rehearsing right now, with every expectation you choose to strengthen. Because in the quiet architecture of consciousness, the future is never something you simply enter. It is something you gradually teach your mind to recognize, until one day, almost without noticing when it happened, you discover that the person you once imagined becoming has been quietly making decisions through you all along.